Hello, in this video we'll have a focus on Hathor and the Sistrum, which is a musical instrument, and Hathor, sometimes pronounced Hathor, is a goddess connected with fertility and joy, music and dancing. And so this is the Nicholson Museum here in Sydney, now that they're doing renovation, but moving to a new site, but the biggest collection in the Southern Hemisphere of ancient artifacts. And so this was the Deaf Magic exhibition. Okay, part of that was a Deaf Magic exhibition, and I'm talking here about the Osiris and Isis, and these are a few of the statues and the eye in the collection there at the Nicholson Museum. But from Herodotus, the story of the god Osiris and his wife sister Isis and their son Horus is one of the most elaborate and fundamental of all Egyptian myths, and of it there are many versions. Osiris, the ruler of Egypt, was murdered by his jealous brother Set, the god of violence and chaos. The connection between 72 and both of them, but anyway, his body was either thrown into the Nile or cut into pieces and scattered across Egypt. That's sort of where, if you've ever heard of a golden phallus, 14 pieces is one version, and are able to they could not find the 14th piece, the penis, and Isis fashioned the golden phallus, which is one of the other versions. But the pieces were recovered and preserved by Isis and her sister Nephthys, who restored Isis to an afterlife in the underworld where he became its ruler. This is the premise of mummification. Pictures of Osiris often shown with green skin. It's interesting that Inanna, the Sumerian goddess, also travelled into the underworld, overthrew her sister, was judged badly because of it, and then she was hung from the wall and her skin turned green as well. So we maybe a more patriarchal Egyptians versus a more matriarchal Sumerians, but again with just this connection between the green. But anyway, Horus is the son of Isis and Osiris. He finally defeated Set, bringing peace and stable dynastic rule in Egypt. In the battle, Horus lost his left eye, torn out by Set. It was found and returned by the goddess Hathor. And there's the eye, the all-seeing eye, could be a connection. Horus gave the eye to Osiris, hoping it would bring his father back to full life. It didn't, but the so-called wedget eye became one of the most powerful of all magical amulets, symbolizing sacrifice, protection, healing, and most importantly, restoration of the body in the afterlife. And the all-seeing eye, just very similar, like depictions of Isis often show her with the child giving milk, and it's interesting that the earliest pictures of Mary are of her of a single breast exposed, feeding the child as well. In the earliest periods of Christianity, Mary had a smaller place, but then she seems to have been elevated around about the year 1000-ish, and the builders of the great cathedrals, but that's another story. Back at the Nicholson, these are some of the Isis statues, busts in the collection. Now we see the child Horus and this carved Isis as well. And you get a view from the back where we even see some hieroglyphs, or maybe hieratics, but hieroglyphs there in the back. And I'll just skip forward. Pardon the pause. And there's also that's the head has been lost, obviously. But also in this collection here, or at least a part of a collection that was on display, we'll see some other Isis figurines and some of the later cultures. So we okay, here Osiris, pretty much the standard version with the hook and flail and the crown there as well. But okay, so we're starting to get a peek over here of Isis, who in later cultures, especially through Greco-Roman period, we see these later versions. Here's a more traditional Egypt version, again with the bare breast and the child. Okay, it's just jumping a bit, but this is back at the Nicholson, and okay, the video's played, it's jumping, but anyway, you get this is a column capital from the Temple of Bastet at Bubastis, and red granite and well, Hathor. So you see the ears and the swirls there, and that will be the focus of it, because there's some nice other connections going on. Pardon the video player's not cooperating at the moment. Okay, there we'll get a bit of view and walk around, because this one's double-sided as well. We'll see that many of these other columns, Hathor column capitals, have four-sided figures, and this one also has some the cartouche of a pharaoh there on the side. I can't remember the name offhand, but roughly around the year 1200 BC, there we see the pharaoh, his cartouche. Anyway, that was important because we saw the importance of the mention of Hathor. Now, she's very important goddess, pretty much like the mother goddess of the Egyptian gods and goddesses. But if we go back, previous video, I mentioned Athanasius Kircher and his book Oedipus Egyptiacus. Sorry for butchering the pronunciation. King Ferdinand, anyway, there, scepter and orb. Again, it's a bit unsure. Rosetta Stone is the official time, but there is some suggestion that that these early Egyptologists, such as Kircher, knew a little bit more than what might be the official history. Again, we see Thoth and all the standard gods there. Even shows, these are some of the obelisks moved from Egypt to Rome back in Constantine's time. And this might be the one that was actually moved to Constantinople. These were over 400 tons moved by barge across the Mediterranean. Some mummies there. Now, the Egyptian Labyrinth, now he also speaks of this in his work as well, and we see like a map of the labyrinth. Interesting, we got the zodiac there, some interesting little tools and items amongst there, but that's not the feature for the moment. But also we see Isis with the pail and with the sistrum, and we see mentions the sistrum and the lyre as well. So the importance of several instruments used by the ancient Egyptians include the sistrum and the lyre, and especially the sistrum being very important. This is a picture of Isis from the Greco-Roman period. Still Isis, it's just now the form's been changed, and we see sistrum. And it's just interesting because what she's holding, again, that pail, a vessel of water, which would figure in well with the previous video where I was looking at these so-called ancient handbags, are they symbols of farming and irrigation? Now, Kircher would suggest so, and it would seem that this fits in with even the Greco-Roman Isis cults. But the sistrum, that's the important figure of this instrument. You can just YouTube search Sistrum to see some examples of what it sounds like. It's anyway, I'll look. But okay, so there we see, basically you have these little bells and you swing it side to side, makes this noise, and this is an interesting feature that we'll be looking at. Cults of Isis, Isis unveiled, still with the sistrum, even basically once again representing Libra, which is the constellation Libra, and who we have the god of weights and measures, Thoth. So again, the sistrum, well, again, now this is interesting because of my thoughts in the last video about the pail, this little bucket thing, being also a connection to weights and measures, and well, we have the god of weights and measures, and we see a double reference to it here in the Isis Unveiled. Goes back to, well, quite some time ago, these cults and legends. So here's some other examples of sistrums, and you see, what do we have here? We have a depiction of Hathor, and well, the sistrum is very, very strongly connected to Hathor, the goddess of joy, feminine love, music, and dancing. And across ancient Egypt, again, we see the sistrum, and again Hathor and Hathor there. This is from the temple of Hathor itself. But back to Kircher. Amongst being an early Egyptologist, hermeticist into geometry and music, especially so in the Musikergy, now universal book on music, basically. Not only does he mention Doric and Ionic and these other important musical scales, modes, which would be only credited to roughly around his period, which, given the fact that Doric and Ionic are so important, ancient systems of weights and measure, and that those proportions actually connect to the music, I would be more inclined to think that the Dorian and Ionian, as well as Lydian, Phrygian, Mixolydian, Locrian, etc., go back some time. But even here on Kircher's work, we see the Egyptian Sistrum to variations on it, as well as Valir, and in his book, in his work on Egyptology, again, the Sistrum and Valir. She's a very old goddess, Hathor. Now, it's argued exactly how old, but some would even suggest that she's meant pre-dynastic, and that it's actually her depicted. See the ears and the ears here on the Nama palette, which is considered the official beginnings of Egyptian history, but that's a whole other thing. But Hathor is a mother goddess associated with joy, dancing, and music. The Sistrum goes much further and much further away. So we have these Anatolian Sistrums. It's a very ancient instrument, and even still to this day in Ethiopia, famous for, some would say, the Ark of the Covenant is here. There's a lot of interesting connections. We have the Axum Stele, 108 feet, the tallest one that's now collapsed. Interesting, it's about 300 tons, half from granite. But in the priests there in Ethiopia still use the Sistrum in their ceremonies. There's a Sistrum, but even this is these are from the museum in Athens, and just worth noting, you see these holes here, again with these rods which were connected through, so they are Sistrums. But back to the Hathor, the column capital. Now these are some Egyptian columns. Now we have the lotus bud, lotus flower, the papyrus, and the palm leaf. But at least later on, probably, not sure the exact date that they were, but anyway, from around about the year 1300 BC, around Akhenaten and Tutankhamun's time, we see the emergence of the Hathor column capital. And there's another, this is from the Temple of Philae, but we'll see these now. This is the one from the Nicholson Museum here in Sydney, and the Temple of Bastet in Bubastis. Now this is red granite, showing the pharaoh. Again, you can just do a search and have a look a bit at read if you want to go a bit further into this, but especially Herodotus mentions that this particular Temple of Bastet was a very important, truly remarkable. Other sanctuaries may be larger or have cost more, but none is more beautiful. So even these older writers mention how important this particular temple is, but there's not much left of it. Philae Temple, okay, just to give you an idea of the location. So there we have Bubastis up here in the delta, and the Temple of Philae is, well, down here now, close as well. I'll get into that next. So we'll look at so we have the Temple of Philae, which has these, they're even called Sistrum columns. Now this box above is meant to represent a sistrum or a music box, so a box would often be attached to a lyre, like a guitar. This box would be used to change the sound of the instrument. Now Abu Simbel, now both Philae and Abu Simbel would have been flooded by the Aswan Dam, but they were moved, and it's an interesting story a little bit. But in Abu Simbel, so little Abu Simbel, we even see Hathor holding the sistrum. And inside the main hall, we see these Hathor columns as well. But that's something else. Here we seem to see some sistrums in Athens Museum. You can even see the holes are still there, and that's where they would affix these bells, cymbals, a bit like a tambourine, almost in a type of way that it sounds, except without the drum. But that's something else. Hathor column here in the Nicholson Museum. Should have mentioned it's about 5 foot high, red granite, quite an impressive piece, considering it was only one of many. The Hathor column, at least, from the Middle Kingdom sort of onwards, probably. Not sure if it goes back to the Old Kingdom, but she was definitely a very important goddess back in the Old Kingdom as well. Temple of Philae, we see this column, and this like literally represents like a sistrum. It's a music box, and we'll see some better examples of that. Temple of Bubastis, and now so where we just some examples of the places where where we find it. So at Bubastis, the Temple of Bastet is one of the places where it's only ruins for the moment. Where is the picture? Okay, so here we see what's left of the Temple of Bastet at Bubastis, mentioned by Herodotus. Temple of Philae, which has these Hathor capitals, and unlike the one at the Nicholson Museum, you see how they point in all four directions, and they're even called Sistrum capitals as well. Abu Simbel has multiple references to it. So at Little Abu Simbel, there's a Hathor, it's a bit damaged, but this Hathor here, we see a close up. She's even holding the Sistrum. These two feathers above her head is another classic example of Hathor. Inside the main hall we see her, but also at the Dendera, which is famous for the zodiac there, and also the so-called light bulbs, which again I think anyway, but the Dendera temple complex. And we see here the Hathor capitals, but you also find it on the inside. So as you enter, we see the Hathor capitals there pointing four directions, lots of them here, this lovely wall as well. But if you zoom in, so there we see it, we can even see the Hathor Sistrum as example there. That's what we're seeing essentially here. At Deir el-Bahari, sorry, that's a typo, there's too many eyes, there's one too many eyes there. But this famous temple complex as well, where we see these Hathor columns. But this one, so we see that's the standard, but see how this one is different, where it has this like a neck, extended neck. Well, literally seeing a sistrum there, and this is a music box, often used in, such as in guitars, to amplify the sound, give it a bit of a different sound. But again, another example of a sistrum with Hathor on there as well. Here are some more classic examples of it, and again, such as the earlier picture I showed from the Athens Museum collection, but you even see that there's little holes there on the side where you would insert the rods, so you could attach those bells in there. So there, okay, back to the Nicholson. These are just the Hathor column capital there in the Nicholson. But that's interesting, because again, it's connecting this with the reason I point this out is because of the connections to especially Hermeticism and to the work of people such as Athanasius Kircher and these early Hermeticists who were working on Egyptian principles, symbols, well over a century before it became popularized, before the Rosetta Stone. And there are some indications that again that they understood hieroglyphs before the Rosetta Stone, but that would be a long story, and again, it's a bit subjective. It depends how you want to read it. But there is some, convincing evidence on my part, but in my own belief. But especially how this would also connect through the types of, such as the Doric and Ionic column, systems of measurement, but also musical modes connecting to Hathor and often connected to Isis here, the Sistrum, but also the lyre, which is so important in Greco-Roman legends, such as Hermes, the god of weights and measures. The caduceus which he carries is literally a wand. Wand literally translates to measuring rod, and that Apollo gave Hermes that wand as a gift in return for Hermes giving Apollo the gift of a lyre, which was made from a tortoiseshell. Where there you go. That's a nice little reference to that as well. And so what we see is even though it sort of will get slightly changed over time, even from ancient Egypt up to at least well beyond the Greco-Roman period, but for instance this Greco-Roman depiction of Isis holding the sistrum and holding the water vessel as well, which would connect to that so-called handbag. And as an example, so I'll put those links in the description as well. Again, it's just one of these symbols that's so important. It's references to fertility, once again, Hathor being a goddess of motherhood, feminine love, milk. That's why she's represented as a cow with cow ears so often. And so just kind collection of thoughts and observations, especially, so for instance, for Labyrinth, and again back to this period before the official history would recognise that this era, 1500s up until the 1700s, early 1700s, was so rich in the origins of modern science, the scientific method, all emerging from hermeticists and people into the esoteric. This is like literally undeniable. It's not even, some might argue with it, but they've got their head in the wrong place, because the hermeticists actually developed a scientific method. The weights and the measures was encoded by them. Wouldn't say, it's often in the official text it will say people like Gunther invented the chain, invented the quadrant and other things. Absolute nonsense. The people from this period were actually just giving a rebirth to older knowledge, where texts such as the Corpus Hermetica was reintroduced to Europe. And we see that, so a fusion of Greek knowledge, because of the Greek and Romans left such comprehensive writings, but they themselves inherited it from an older tradition, and more likely than not because of the importance they put on it, the mystery schools going back to Egypt and places such as Heliopolis. Baalbek, under the Roman era, would be renamed Heliopolis as well. Memphis as well, that was so important in the Exodus story. But anyway, yeah, the pyramid, Hermeticism, Greek goddesses and Greek gods, goddesses connecting to Egyptian gods and goddesses. Very interesting period, because it's so often written in symbols, written in a non-literal way. We're very stuck on literal. We've lost our ability to read symbols now, because people were less literate previously. Like, the written word was not something they understood very well, or was restricted, but people were actually much more literate in a symbolic sense, and that's why these older Bibles would have pictures and images. And like when we look at a stained glass, we sort of might not pay attention to the intricate little details, but over the last few years, especially studying these things, it's like you start to you reawaken your symbolic eye, so to speak. And as you learn the legends, the stories, you realize, well, there's quite a bit of information here, and it's not just religious, strictly speaking, because in these older stories there's a lot of astronomical symbolism. There's a lot of weights and measure and scientific symbolism, a lot of historic symbolism, which again just points to these things. And so for instance, the Isis unveiled, a very modern example of where this was reawakened from the writings of people like Pliny, Ovid, and these ancient writings, still connected. And again, even the modern symbols. What do we have? A sheaf of wheat. That's a symbol of measurement, because you use grains to measure not only weight, as in bullets are still measured, the weight, the amount of gunpowder is still called grains, but grains also defines an inch. For instance, 3 barley corn was 1 inch. So both weights and measures come from grain. Libra, the constellation, holds grain in one hand, and Virgo, as in the Virgin, as in Isis, or as in Ishtar/Inanna in Babylonian terms. She stands above Libra, the scales, and the grain, is literally connected. And so here you just see just a wonderful depiction. So not only seeing music and a nice little navigation reference, but here, like, we're literally seeing depictions of weights and measure, and connected here with Thoth, god of weights and measures, science, knowledge, etc. And you even see the twin crowns over there. Anyway, it's a bit chaotic, but hope you enjoyed. I'll put some links in the description, because especially I did a series on the wand, and how the magic wand literally translates to a measuring rod, and that Kundalini, as it's called, or the Caduceus of Hermes, is literally a definition, a symbol of the importance of measurement, in literally, as in a wand. And so, okay, with that, hope you enjoyed, and have a good